On the morning of August 15, 1945, Vice Admiral Miwa Shigeyoshi sat in his office at the Combined Fleet headquarters in Tokyo. The war had ended hours earlier with Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast. Around him, staff officers burned documents. Outside, the city smoldered from months of American firebombing. But Miwa was not watching the flames. He was staring at a chart on his desk. The chart showed shipping losses, month by month, year by year. The lines descended like a staircase into an abyss. By the time the war ended, Japan had lost more than 8 million tons of merchant shipping, over 2,800 vessels sent to the bottom, 60% of Japan's merchant fleet gone. The chart did not show the faces of the 100,000 merchant seamen who died. It did not show the millions of tons of oil, rubber, rice, and steel that never reached Japanese shores. It showed only numbers. But those numbers told a story that Japanese naval leadership had refused to believe until it was far too late. The story of how American submarines destroyed the Japanese Empire begins not with the attack on Pearl Harbor, but decades earlier, in the years when Japan's naval leadership formed the doctrines that would lead them to catastrophe. Those doctrines were shaped by a singular obsession with decisive battle, with honor, with the belief that wars were won through the clash of battleships in one climactic engagement. Japanese naval strategy in the early 20th century was dominated by the influence of American naval theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan. His book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, published in 1890, argued that command of the sea was achieved through decisive fleet actions. The Japanese Naval General Staff studied Mahan intensely. They incorporated his theories into their doctrine. They built a navy designed to win one great battle that would decide control of the Pacific. This obsession was reinforced by Japan's experience in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. On May 27 and 28, 1905, the Japanese combined fleet under Admiral Togo Heihachiro met the Russian Baltic Fleet in the Tsushima Strait. The battle was decisive. The Japanese sank 21 Russian ships and captured 6 more. Russian casualties exceeded 10,000. Japanese casualties were fewer than 700. It was one of the most complete naval victories in history. Tsushima became the defining moment in Japanese naval thinking. Every admiral who would lead Japan in World War II had been shaped by its lessons. Yamamoto Isoroku, who would plan the Pearl Harbor attack, was a young ensign at Tsushima. He was wounded in the battle, losing 2 fingers. Nagano Osami, who would serve as chief of the Naval General Staff, was also present. So was Kato Kanji, who would later lead the fleet faction that pushed for naval expansion. The lesson they drew from Tsushima was simple. Wars were won through decisive fleet engagement. Battleships were the ultimate weapon. Lesser forms of warfare, commerce raiding, blockade, the patient work of economic strangulation, these were unworthy of a warrior navy. They were the tactics of weaker powers. Japan would win through strength, through the clash of great ships, through one decisive battle. This doctrine shaped everything: ship design, fleet organization, training, strategic planning. Japan built the largest battleships in the world, the Yamato and Musashi, each displacing over 70,000 tons, mounting 18-inch naval guns, the most powerful naval rifles ever built. These ships were not designed to escort convoys or patrol sea lanes. They were designed to annihilate the American battle fleet in one climactic engagement. Submarines, in this doctrine, played a supporting role. They were scouts for the fleet. They would locate the enemy battle line, report its position, perhaps conduct torpedo attacks to weaken it before the decisive engagement. But they would not engage in independent commerce warfare. That was considered ungentlemanly, a violation of international law, and strategically irrelevant. Wars were not won by sinking merchant ships. They were won by destroying enemy battle fleets. This belief was so deeply embedded that Japan entered World War II with almost no preparation for defending its own merchant shipping. The Naval General Staff had prepared no convoy system. They had built insufficient escort vessels. They had trained no specialized anti-submarine warfare crews. They had not even established a unified command structure for merchant shipping protection. In 1941, Japan's merchant fleet totaled approximately 6 million tons. This fleet was absolutely critical to Japan's war effort. Japan is an island nation with minimal natural resources. Every gallon of oil, every ton of rubber, every ounce of tin, bauxite, iron ore, all of it had to be imported from the conquered territories in Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies. Without those imports, Japanese industry would stop. The military would have no fuel. The war machine would grind to a halt. Japanese naval planners understood this at some level, but they believed the decisive battle would come quickly. The Americans would sortie their fleet to relieve the Philippines, the combined fleet would meet them somewhere in the Western Pacific, the battle would be fought and won, and then the Americans would sue for peace, just as the Russians had after Tsushima. The war would be over before the slow work of commerce warfare could matter. They were wrong about everything. The Americans did not come out for a decisive battle. American submarines did engage in systematic commerce warfare, and the slow strangulation of Japan's merchant fleet proved far more decisive than any battleship duel could ever have been. The first American submarine war patrol in the Western Pacific began on December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. The submarine Swordfish departed from Manila Bay under the command of Lieutenant Commander Chester Carl Smith. Her mission was to patrol the approaches to Hong Kong and attack Japanese shipping. On December 9th, she sank the 8,600-ton Japanese transport Asuta-san Maru. It was the first Japanese merchant ship sunk by American action in World War II. The sinking demonstrated what Japanese doctrine had refused to acknowledge. American submarines could operate independently, far from their bases, attacking Japan's vulnerable supply lines. And there was nothing particularly honorable or dishonorable about it. It was simply effective. But the early years of the American submarine campaign were marked by significant problems. American torpedoes were defective. The Mark 14 torpedo, which equipped American submarines at the start of the war, suffered from multiple critical flaws. The magnetic exploder often detonated prematurely or not at all. The contact exploder frequently failed on impact. Torpedoes ran deeper than their set depth, passing harmlessly beneath their targets. Submarine commanders reported these problems repeatedly. Their reports were dismissed by the Bureau of Ordnance. Admiral Charles Lockwood, who became Commander Submarine Force Pacific Fleet in February 1943, later described the torpedo situation as a disaster that cost American submarines 18 months of effective combat operations. It was not until September 1943 that the problems were fully resolved. Even with defective torpedoes, American submarines sank significant tonnage. In 1942, they sank approximately 1 million tons of Japanese shipping. In 1943, the total reached approximately 1.8 million tons. These losses were serious but not yet catastrophic. Japan's merchant marine could still function. Supplies still reached the home islands and the forward bases. The Japanese response was inadequate from the beginning. The Navy insisted that it could not spare destroyers for convoy escort. Those ships were needed for the decisive battle that was always just over the horizon. Merchant ships sailed independently or in small groups with minimal protection. When losses mounted, the Navy created the Grand Escort Command in November 1943, but by then it was far too late. The infrastructure for effective convoy protection did not exist, the specialized training had not been done, the doctrine had not been developed. Japanese anti-submarine warfare relied primarily on depth charges. These were less effective than the more sophisticated weapon systems the Allies developed. Japanese sonar was inferior to American and British systems. Detection ranges were shorter. Accuracy was poor. Japanese escort vessels often could not locate submerged submarines even when they knew approximately where the submarine had dived. The fundamental problem was doctrinal. Japanese naval leadership still believed that merchant shipping protection was a secondary concern. The real war would be won through surface engagement. This belief persisted even as the evidence mounted that American submarines were systematically destroying Japan's capacity to wage war. By early 1944, the situation had become critical. American torpedo problems had been resolved. American submarine production had ramped up dramatically. The number of submarines on patrol in Japanese waters increased month by month, and American commanders had developed tactics specifically designed to maximize merchant ship kills. Submarines operated in coordinated wolf packs. They concentrated near critical choke points where Japanese shipping had to pass: the Luzon Strait between Taiwan and the Philippines, the approaches to Singapore, the waters off the coast of French Indochina. American submarines waited in these areas and attacked everything that moved. The statistics from 1944 tell the story. American submarines sank approximately 600 Japanese merchant ships, totaling over 2.7 million tons. In addition, they sank 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, 11 cruisers, and 38 destroyers and other warships. But it was the merchant tonnage that mattered. Those ships carried the oil that fueled Japanese industry. They carried the rubber for tires, the bauxite for aluminum, the iron ore for steel production. Without them, Japan could not build aircraft, could not fuel its ships, could not even feed its civilian population adequately. The collapse was exponential. As Japan lost merchant ships, it became harder to transport the raw materials needed to build replacements. As industrial capacity declined, it became harder to construct the escort vessels needed to protect the remaining merchants. As oil supplies dwindled, it became impossible to train new pilots adequately or to sortie the combined fleet for major operations. The entire war economy entered a death spiral. Japanese admirals watched this happen. They received the reports. They saw the numbers. Month by month, the chart lines descended, and still they clung to their doctrine. Still they believed that one decisive battle would change everything. Still they prioritized battleship operations over convoy protection. In June 1944, the Japanese combined fleet sorted for what became known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo commanded 9 carriers, 5 battleships, and numerous cruisers and destroyers. The goal was to destroy the American fleet supporting the invasion of Saipan. The battle was a catastrophic defeat for Japan. American carrier aircraft destroyed over 400 Japanese planes in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost 3 carriers. The combined fleet retreated. What made the defeat particularly devastating was that Japan could not replace the lost aircraft or train new pilots. Fuel shortages had already forced severe cutbacks in training. New pilots reached their units with fewer than half the flight hours of their American counterparts. Many had never trained for carrier operations. Many had never practiced attacking moving targets. They were sent into combat and slaughtered. The fuel crisis was directly caused by submarine warfare. In 1944, American submarines sank over 600,000 tons of tankers. Japan began the war with approximately 680,000 tons of tanker capacity. By mid-1944, more than half of that capacity was gone. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies still produced. The refineries at Palembang and Balikpapan still operated. But the oil could not reach Japan. The tankers lay at the bottom of the South China Sea and the Philippine Sea, sent there by American submarines.
The realization came slowly, then all at once. For Japanese naval leadership, the moment of understanding arrived not through a single catastrophic event, but through the accumulation of impossible-to-ignore evidence. By late 1944, the carefully constructed illusions that had sustained their doctrine for 4 decades began to crumble. Admiral Toyoda Soemu, who became Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet in May 1944, faced a stark reality. His predecessor, Admiral Koga Minachi, had died in a plane crash while evacuating from Palau. Koga himself had replaced Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, killed by American fighters in April 1943 after American codebreakers intercepted his travel plans. The combined fleet had lost 3 commanders in less than 2 years. But the greater loss was not the admirals. It was the ships they could no longer fuel, the aircraft they could no longer replace, the merchant vessels they could no longer protect. The statistics that crossed Toyoda's desk told a story that contradicted everything he had been taught at the Naval Academy. In October 1944 alone, American submarines sank 320,000 tons of Japanese shipping. That single month's losses exceeded Japan's entire shipbuilding capacity. For every ship launched, 3 were sunk. The mathematics were brutally simple. Japan was losing. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 represented the last sortie of the Japanese combined fleet as an effective fighting force. It was the largest naval battle in history. Over 200,000 men participated. Japan committed virtually everything it had left: 4 carriers, 9 battleships, 20 cruisers, 35 destroyers. The Americans had a similar number of major combatants. This was the decisive battle that Japanese doctrine had always envisioned, the climactic engagement that would determine control of the Pacific. Japan lost, catastrophically. 4 carriers sunk, 3 battleships sunk, 10 cruisers sunk, 11 destroyers sunk. Over 12,000 Japanese sailors died. The American losses were significant but manageable: 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort. The combined fleet ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. But what made the defeat truly devastating was not just the losses in battle, it was the realization that came with those losses. The battle had been fought, the decisive engagement had occurred, and it had changed nothing. Even if Japan had won at Leyte Gulf, even if every American ship had been sunk, it would not have mattered. The war was already lost, not because of battleship actions, but because Japan's merchant fleet had been destroyed. The oil could not reach the home islands, the rubber could not be transported, the food could not be delivered. The industrial base was collapsing. American submarines had accomplished what Japanese admirals had considered impossible. They had won the war without firing a shot at the combined fleet. They had won it by patient, systematic destruction of Japan's economic capacity to wage war.
The numbers were staggering. In 1944, American submarines sank over 600 merchant ships. By the end of that year, Japan had lost over 4 million tons of merchant shipping since the start of the war. Replacement construction had added only about 3 million tons. The net loss was catastrophic, and 1945 would be even worse. Vice Admiral Miwa Shigeyoshi, who became commander of the 6th Fleet, Japan's submarine force, in November 1944, understood what had happened better than most. Miwa had commanded submarines earlier in the war. He had seen firsthand how Japanese submarine doctrine focused on fleet support rather than commerce raiding. Japanese submarines had been designed and operated to attack American warships. They were large, fast, long-ranged boats optimized for fleet actions. They carried reconnaissance seaplanes. They were equipped with sophisticated fire control systems for surface engagements. And they had accomplished almost nothing of strategic value. Japanese submarines sank approximately 180 American merchant ships during the entire war. By comparison, American submarines sank over 1,000 Japanese merchant ships in 1944 alone. The disparity was not due to superior American submarines.
Japanese boats were in many ways more sophisticated. The I-class submarines were among the largest and most capable in the world, but they were hunting the wrong targets. Miwa wrote after the war that the Japanese Navy's failure to protect merchant shipping was the greatest strategic mistake of the Pacific War. He stated that anti-submarine warfare had been neglected almost entirely in pre-war planning. When the war began, Japan had no convoy system, no specialized escort vessels, no trained anti-submarine warfare crews, and no doctrine for protecting sea lanes. The Naval General Staff had assumed that merchant protection could be handled by second-line destroyers and auxiliary vessels. They were wrong. The Grand Escort Command, established in November 1943, was too little, too late. Captain Omae Toshikazu, who served on the Naval General Staff, later described the organization as inadequate from its inception. It was given insufficient resources, insufficient authority, and insufficient priority. Escort vessels were constantly diverted to support fleet operations. Training was minimal, equipment was obsolete. The officers assigned to escort duty were often those considered unsuitable for more prestigious postings with the combined fleet. Japanese depth charges were less effective than Allied models. They had smaller explosive charges and less sophisticated fusing mechanisms. Japanese sonar systems lagged behind American and British technology by several years. Detection ranges rarely exceeded 1,000 yards under ideal conditions. In poor sea conditions, detection was often impossible. American submarines operating submerged could frequently approach convoys undetected, attack, and escape before escorts could even locate them. The lack of air cover was another critical failure. The Japanese Navy and Army competed for resources throughout the war. Coordination between services was poor. Land-based aircraft that could have provided convoy protection were instead committed to supporting ground operations or retained for homeland defense. Japan never developed an effective maritime patrol aircraft comparable to the American PBY Catalina or the British Short Sunderland. Convoys sailed without air cover, making them easy targets for surfaced submarines that could outrun the slow escort vessels.
By early 1945, the situation had become hopeless. American submarines operated with near impunity in what had once been Japanese-controlled waters. They entered Tokyo Bay, they shelled shore installations with deck guns, they laid mines in harbors and shipping channels. The few remaining Japanese merchant ships rarely left port. When they did, they sailed at night, hugging coastlines, hoping to avoid detection. Many never completed their voyages. The oil crisis became acute in January 1945. Tanker losses had reduced Japan's ability to import petroleum to a trickle. Fuel allocations for training were cut to almost nothing. New pilots received as few as 50 hours of flight time before being sent to combat units. American pilots typically had 300 hours or more. The disparity in skill showed in the casualty rates. Japanese pilots died at rates that made replacement impossible. The few experienced aviators who remained were exhausted, flying mission after mission because there was no one else qualified to fly. The combined fleet sat at anchor, immobilized by lack of fuel. The super battleship Yamato, the pride of the Imperial Navy, consumed so much fuel oil that it could barely be operated. When it was finally sent on a suicide mission to Okinawa in April 1945, the Navy could only scrape together enough fuel for a one-way voyage. The ship was not expected to return. It did not. American carrier aircraft sank it on April 7th, along with one cruiser and 4 of its 8 escorting destroyers. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors died. Food shortages reached crisis levels in the home islands. Rice imports from Southeast Asia had been almost completely cut off. Fish catches declined as fuel for fishing vessels became unavailable. Urban populations faced near starvation. Industrial workers were weak from malnutrition. Production declined not just from lack of raw materials, but from lack of calories to sustain the workforce. The merchant marine itself was close to collapse. Crews refused to sail, knowing that most voyages ended in death.
The survival rate for Japanese merchant seamen by 1945 was among the lowest of any occupation in the war. Over 60,000 merchant sailors died, more than half of all who served. Ships that survived one voyage were often so damaged that they required extensive repairs before sailing again. Repair facilities were overwhelmed, dry docks were full, materials for repairs were unavailable. Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa, who served as Navy Minister and later Prime Minister, later stated that Japan had lost the war when it lost control of its sea lanes. He said that the Navy's pre-war focus on decisive battle had blinded leadership to the reality of modern industrial warfare. Wars were no longer won through single climactic engagements. They were won through sustained economic pressure, through the patient destruction of an enemy's capacity to continue fighting. Vice Admiral Fukudome Shigeru, who served as Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, acknowledged after the war that American submarine warfare had been devastatingly effective. He stated that Japanese countermeasures had been inadequate and that the Naval General Staff had underestimated the threat until it was too late to respond effectively. He noted that by mid-1944, staff officers were aware that Japan was losing the tonnage war, but that they had no effective means to reverse the trend.
The psychological impact on Japanese naval leadership was profound. These were men who had spent their entire careers preparing for surface engagement. They had studied Tsushima. They had trained for the decisive battle. They had built the most powerful battleships in the world. And all of it had been rendered irrelevant by a form of warfare they had dismissed as strategically insignificant. Captain Oi Atsushi, who served in the Naval General Staff's Operations Section, wrote after the war that the staff had been aware of mounting merchant losses, but had consistently prioritized fleet operations over convoy protection. He stated that this was partly due to institutional bias within the Navy, where officers viewed escort duty as inglorious and career-limiting. The best officers, the best ships, the best equipment all went to the combined fleet. Convoy protection received whatever was left over. This institutional bias had deep roots. In the Japanese Navy, service on battleships and carriers was prestigious. Service on destroyers was acceptable. Service on escort vessels or minesweepers was considered a dead end. Officers assigned to anti-submarine warfare duties often felt that they had been passed over for more important positions. This created a self-fulfilling prophecy. The best talent went to fleet units. Escort forces were led by less capable officers. Performance suffered. The institutional bias was reinforced. The contrast with American practice was stark. The United States Navy took anti-submarine warfare seriously from the beginning. Convoy escort was considered vital work. Officers were trained specifically for escort duties. Doctrine was developed and refined based on British experience in the Atlantic. Equipment was continuously improved. Coordination between surface escorts and air cover was practiced extensively. The result was that American merchant losses to Japanese submarines were minimal, despite Japan's sophisticated submarine fleet. Japanese submarines spent the war hunting American warships, while American submarines destroyed Japan's merchant fleet. Japanese boats were technically impressive. The Type B submarines displaced over 2,600 tons surfaced. They had ranges exceeding 20,000 nautical miles. They carried Yokosuka E-14Y reconnaissance seaplanes in watertight hangars. Some carried midget submarines for special operations. They were marvels of engineering. And they were strategically irrelevant. American submarines were simpler, smaller, less sophisticated in some ways. The Gato class displaced about 1,500 tons surfaced. They carried no aircraft, their equipment was often improvised and field-modified, but they were hunting the right targets. They sank tankers carrying oil from Borneo. They sank freighters carrying rubber from Malaya. They sank transports carrying troops to forward bases. Every sinking weakened Japan's ability to continue the war. The final statistics are overwhelming. American submarines sank 1,178 Japanese merchant ships, totaling approximately 4.9 million tons. They sank an additional 214 Japanese naval vessels, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. They conducted over 1,500 war patrols. 52 American submarines were lost, 16 to enemy action, the rest to accidents or unknown causes. Over 3,600 American submariners died. The casualty rate was the highest of any branch of the American military, over 22%.
But those losses achieved results that changed the course of the war. By August 1945, Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to less than 2 million tons, roughly one-third of what it possessed in December 1941. The nation was starving. Industry had collapsed. The military could not operate. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought the formal end. But Japan had already been defeated. The defeat had come not in climactic battle, but through the slow strangulation of its maritime supply lines. Vice Admiral Miwa sat in his office on August 15, 1945, staring at that chart. The lines descended like stairs into darkness. Each step represented hundreds of ships, thousands of lives, millions of tons of cargo that never reached its destination. The chart represented the complete failure of everything he had been taught, everything Japanese naval doctrine had assumed to be true. After the war, Miwa was direct in his assessments. He stated that Japan's defeat in the Pacific War was fundamentally a defeat in the war against American submarines. He noted that the combined fleet had been essentially powerless to prevent the destruction of Japan's merchant marine. He acknowledged that pre-war planning had been completely inadequate and that the Naval General Staff had failed to recognize the nature of modern industrial warfare until far too late. Other senior Japanese naval officers echoed similar assessments in the post-war period. Admiral Nomura Naokuni, who served as Vice Chief of the Naval General Staff, stated that the loss of merchant shipping was the decisive factor in Japan's defeat. Captain Nakajima Chikataka, who served in the Naval General Staff's logistics section, calculated that by mid-1944, Japan was losing merchant tonnage 3 times faster than it could be replaced. He noted that staff officers recognized the mathematics but lacked the means to change them. The institutional failure was complete. The doctrine that had guided Japanese naval thinking since Tsushima had proven catastrophically wrong. The decisive battle had been fought at Leyte Gulf, and it had not mattered. The super battleships had been built, and they had accomplished nothing. The elaborate war plans had been executed, and they had failed. Not because of poor execution, not because of tactical mistakes, but because the fundamental assumptions were wrong. Wars in the industrial age were not won through single decisive engagements. They were won through logistics, through industrial capacity, through the patient application of economic pressure. The Americans understood this. They built submarines not to glory in combat, but to systematically destroy Japan's capacity to sustain its war effort. And it worked.
The irony is profound. Japan possessed one of the world's finest submarine fleets. The I-class boats were sophisticated, capable vessels operated by well-trained crews. They achieved remarkable feats. I-19 sank the carrier Wasp and damaged the battleship North Carolina with a single salvo of torpedoes in September 1942. I-26 sank the cruiser Juno in November 1942, an attack that killed all 5 Sullivan brothers and led to changes in American military policy regarding family members serving together. Japanese submarines conducted supply runs to isolated garrisons, transported commando teams, gathered intelligence. But they did not wage effective commerce warfare. They hunted warships while American submarines destroyed merchant vessels. The Japanese strategy yielded occasional spectacular successes and strategic irrelevance. The American strategy yielded consistent results that won the war. The human cost was staggering.
Over 100,000 Japanese merchant seamen died. Entire crews disappeared when ships were torpedoed in distant waters. Bodies were never recovered. Families received notification months after the deaths occurred. The men who sailed Japan's merchant ships knew their chances. By 1945, they knew that most voyages ended in death. Many sailed anyway because they had no choice. Conscription for merchant service was enforced. Desertion was punished harshly. They sailed, and they died. The American submariners who sank those ships faced their own moral complexities. They attacked vessels carrying not just military supplies, but food, medicine, civilian passengers. They knew that each torpedo launched meant dozens or hundreds of deaths. Some submarine commanders struggled with this. Others became hardened to it. All of them understood that this was the nature of the war they were fighting. Japan had started the war with a surprise attack. The Americans would finish it through whatever means proved effective. The doctrine that had blinded Japanese naval leadership to the submarine threat had deep cultural roots. The samurai tradition emphasized honor in direct combat. The warrior faced his enemy openly. Submarine warfare was seen as inherently dishonorable, a form of ambush that violated the code of Bushido. This cultural bias reinforced the institutional bias. Officers who believed that wars were won through courage and spirit could not accept that wars might actually be won through patient, unglamorous work in the shadows. The Americans had no such cultural constraints. They understood war as a practical matter of destroying the enemy's capacity to fight. If submarines could accomplish that more effectively than battleships, then submarines would be used. There was nothing dishonorable about it. It was simply effective. When the war ended, Japan's merchant marine was destroyed. The few surviving ships were old, damaged, barely seaworthy. The infrastructure for maritime commerce had collapsed. Ports were damaged or destroyed. Repair facilities were inoperable. The workforce was depleted. Rebuilding would take years. The lessons learned came too late to matter. By the time Japanese naval leadership fully understood what had happened, the war was over. The chart that Vice Admiral Miwa studied on August 15th showed the complete story. A maritime nation had been strangled by the loss of its maritime lifelines. An island empire had been defeated by the destruction of the ships that connected it to its conquests. In the post-war years, former Japanese naval officers wrote extensively about their failures. The assessments were remarkably candid. They acknowledged the doctrine had been wrong, that planning had been inadequate, that institutional biases had prevented effective response. Some of this was genuine reflection. Some was perhaps an attempt to explain inexcusable failures. But the basic facts were undeniable. Japan had entered the war unprepared to defend its merchant shipping. It had remained unprepared throughout the war, and it had paid the price. The American submarine campaign in the Pacific stands as one of the most successful applications of commerce warfare in military history. Fewer than 200 submarines, operating thousands of miles from their bases, destroyed the maritime commerce of an entire empire. They did so despite torpedo defects that plagued operations for the first 2 years. They did so while facing Japanese anti-submarine forces that, while inadequate, still posed real dangers. 52 American submarines were lost, but the survivors accomplished what the massive American surface fleet and air forces could not accomplish alone. They made it impossible for Japan to continue fighting. The story of Japanese admirals and American submarine warfare is ultimately a story about the cost of doctrinal rigidity. Japanese naval leadership spent 4 decades preparing for a specific kind of war. When they got a different kind of war, they could not adapt. The institutions, the training, the equipment, the entire culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy was oriented toward decisive surface engagement. Changing that orientation would have required admitting that 4 decades of planning had been fundamentally misguided. That admission came only after defeat was total and unavoidable. Vice Admiral Miwa's chart, with its descending lines, told that story more clearly than any battle report or strategic assessment. The numbers did not lie. Over 1,000 Japanese merchant ships lost, nearly 5 million tons sent to the bottom. An empire strangled by submarines that Japanese doctrine had deemed strategically irrelevant. On that morning of August 15, 1945, sitting in his office with the chart before him, Miwa understood completely what he had been too constrained by doctrine to understand 4 years earlier. American submarines had not won the war through honor or courage or the warrior spirit that Japanese naval culture revered. They had won it through patient, systematic destruction of Japan's economic capacity. They had won it by sinking freighters and tankers and transports. They had won it through unglamorous work in dangerous waters, attacking targets the Japanese doctrine considered unworthy of a warrior's attention. They had won. Japan had lost, and the chart showed exactly how and why. The truth about the story of this war wasn't written in the annals of great battles or glorious last stands, but in the cold arithmetic of tonnage lost and supply lines severed. It was written in the darkness of the deep Pacific, where merchant ships slipped beneath the waves and took with them Japan's ability to sustain the war it had started. Each sinking was a small tragedy, a ship and its crew lost. Together, they were an avalanche that buried an empire. If this deep dive into one of World War II's most decisive yet often overlooked campaigns resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these critical historical stories to light and ensures that the lessons learned at such tremendous cost are not forgotten by future generations.